Welcome to the EPG Pathshala Linguistics course. I'm Prabal Dasgupta from the Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata. I'm responsible for the paper that handles morphology and syntax. And in this session, we shall cover module 24, which is about complements and relatives. And this module has the objective of clarifying the status of complement clauses and relative clauses in the horseshoe framework. We begin by recalling that from the end of the preceding module, which dealt with questions and movements, we have a residual issue to deal with. At the end of that module, in the e-text, not in the oral exposition, we were on the verge of asking ourselves what happens to those derivations that need to be filtered out because they have incorrectly generated a plus WH element at the left of the sentence, incorrectly in the sense that in those derivations, there is no WH constituent inside the sentence that actually moves to that plus WH placeholder slot and erases it. We were also concerned for the same reason with those derivations that will need to be filtered out because they have similarly inappropriately base generated, that is to say generated in the deep structure by using the base of the syntactic framework. They have base generated an X with element. Recall that X with is the volatile element. With is supposed to remind you of the word whether and the word if. And that is the volatile element which serves as a placeholder into which the moving auxiliary is placed when subject auxiliary inversion occurs. Now take a sentence in which the derivation has generated X with on the left edge of the clause, but it turns out that subject auxiliary inversion does not apply. If that happens, what do we want to do? How do we want to filter out these derivations? What do we need to put in place in the mechanisms so that they get filtered out? One may be tempted to compare these questions, which are actually technical questions, with the substantive question that we considered in the context of the incorrect sentence, John did fly a kite, or sentences like that, where the did is unstressed and appears to the left of a verb. Instead of saying John did fly a kite, one says John flew a kite. The question is, if you recall, how does one handle the fact that people speaking English don't say John did fly a kite with did unstressed? Recall that we were considering two strategies and did not resolve the issue, postponing it for advanced syntax. The two strategies were either prevent the derivation from happening at all, find some way to block the derivation. That was called the prevention strategy. The other strategy was the repair-seeking strategy, which tries to repair the derivation after letting it happen. That would, in the case that we are discussing, turn John did fly a kite into John flew a kite. In other words, well, I'm sorry, I take that back. The repair-seeking strategy in the case of John did fly a kite takes the form of saying if the derivation does indeed go through, when you're considering the derivation, make sure that the did gets stressed. That is the way to repair that derivation. You may be tempted to apply that debate, to bring that debate to bear on the issues we are now considering about how to filter out the derivations that inappropriately generate a plus WH or that generate an X with and then end up not using these devices, and therefore creating a traffic jam at the surface structure because surface structures cannot handle these gadgetry, these pieces of gadgetry. There is a mistake involved in imagining that the problem of John did fly a kite and the problem of an inappropriately generated unused plus WH element or an inappropriately generated and unused X whiff element are the same kind of problem and should be approached in the same fashion and therefore deserve to be placed in the debate between preventionism and the repair-seeking strategy. The reason that such thinking is on the wrong track is as follows. In the case we considered earlier, like John did fly a kite, with whatever other words you want to put into the sentence, what matters is that an unstressed did precedes a verb. It doesn't matter what the subject is and what the rest of the verb phrase is. The difficulty there is that there is an empirical fact about the language that we need to handle. English does not allow people to say John did fly a kite with did unstressed. Whatever we do in the syntactic account needs to reflect this fact. And that is why we were debating between the two strategies for handling the issue, that there are going to be some derivations that try to make you say John did fly a kite. And the question is what to do about them. Do you want to stop the derivations or do you want to let them happen but then add that the phonology must insist on the did being stressed? In the present cases, the cases of plus WH or X whiz being inappropriately generated in some derivations, we have created the problem ourselves through our technical gadgetry. If we wish to solve a problem that we have created ourselves, our best bet is to throw the derivations away, to filter them out. The question of a repair approach does not arise because there is no point in repairing these derivations. Repairing these derivations and somehow making them work is not going to help us to address any fact of human languages. That is the fundamental difference at the conceptual level between the problem of a derivation that generates John did fly a kite and the problem of derivations that leave plus WH or X whiff unused at the end of the derivation because the necessary events did not take place for these elements to be properly utilized. In order to grasp more clearly the fundamental difference between filtering problems that have to do with issues in human languages, empirical issues, and filtering problems that are a result of the technical devices we have created as grammarians, we now take you to those examples which originally prompted the discussion of filtering when transformational grammarians in the 1960s were perfecting their gadgetry. I am referring to facts about relative clauses. You have not yet seen relative clauses, but we did very quickly give you a classification of pronouns in traditional grammar, and in that context we informed you that among the types of pronouns are interrogative pronouns, who, which, where with a question mark, and relative pronouns, who, which, where, and so on without a question mark. Let us now give examples of the relative and interrogative constructions. So you get whom did you meet in Delhi, question mark, that's an interrogative sentence with a question word who. And Balu is the man whom you met in Delhi, where whom is a relative clause that takes the man as its antecedent. Consequently, whom you met in Delhi in that example is a relative clause, not a question. Likewise, which pizza did you order, question mark, is a question. But Ram likes the pizza which you ordered, has which you ordered as a relative clause. Where did you get off the bus is a question, but this must be the place where you got off the bus, has where you got off the bus as a relative clause. You can multiply these examples as much as you want. If you go to the e-text, you will see that the label bracketing, where these examples are shown, indicates how the relative clause is attached to the matrix sentence in which it is embedded. You will find that The place where you got off the bus is shown as a noun phrase within which there is a noun phrase again and a sentence. And that daughter noun phrase is the place, and the sentence is the relative clause where you got off the bus. In other words, the relative clause introducing phrase structure rule says NP goes to NPS. As you see when you examine the format of this phrase structure rule, NP goes to NPS is a recursive rule. In other words, since NP appears to the left of the arrow and also to the right of the arrow, you can reapply the phrase structure rule, and therefore you can get NP dominating NPS, and this NP again dominates NPS, and this NP again dominates NPS. So you end up getting NPSSS. You can get 2 or 3 or multiple relatives, put one on top of the other, which is called stacking of relative clauses. Stacking of relative clauses can be exemplified very quickly by saying the place where you got off the bus, where you can order some pizza if you want, where you can wait for your friend if you want, and so on. You can just put in lots of relatives, and it is possible to analyze them as being stacked by applying the recursive rule. There is a reason why we are emphasizing the fact that relative clauses can be stacked and that the relative clause rule is recursive. The reason is that this module is called relatives and complements, and we will compare this phrase structure rule with another relatively similar phrase structure rule, which introduces det ns under NP, where the S is called the complement clause. And as you can see from a rule that has NP on the left of the arrow and det ns to the right of the arrow, there is no recursion. So the rule can apply only once, which means that complement clauses cannot be stacked. We will return to this subtopic in due course. Right now, the reason we have brought up relative clauses at this stage of the discussion is in connection to connect it to the filtering problem. We want to show you why relative clauses were the occasion for the filtering problem to be raised for the first time when transformational syntacticians arrived at this juncture in their work. Now consider a derivation in which Balu is the man who you met in Delhi is at the deep structure stage. Obviously, whom you met in Delhi is in the surface structure order, whom has been moved to the front of that clause by WH movement. Relative clauses and interrogative clauses both apply WH movement. The difference between them is that the interrogative clause moves the WH constituent to a position in the clause marked by the dummy placeholder plus WH that we were discussing at the end of the preceding module. Relative clauses, in contrast, have a dummy placeholder that we write as minus WH in order to distinguish relatives from interrogatives. Thus, we imagine a feature WH for which the plus value is question and the minus value is relative. This means that a surface structure like Balu is the man whom you met in Delhi starts out as the deep structure. Balu is the man, sentence begins, plus WH, you met whom, subject, verb, object, in Delhi. That's the deep structure. Whom is going to later move to the minus WH position at the left edge of that clause. This movement will be effected by WH movement. The rule is identical between relatives and interrogatives. The two constructions are not distinguished by not applying WH movement. They both apply WH movement. The difference is that interrogatives apply an additional rule when they are root sentences, namely they apply subject auxiliary inversion, whereas relative clauses never apply subject auxiliary inversion because they never get a chance to be root sentences, so the question doesn't arise. Now we come to the filtering problem. Consider a set of phrase structure rule applications and lexical insertions that give rise to an inappropriate deep structure. For example, Balu is the man minus WH, you met Jane in Delhi rather than you met whom in Delhi. Now, given the deep structure Balu is the man minus WH, you met Jane in Delhi, there is no way for WH movement to apply and move anything to the minus WH, taking its place and producing a relative clause that you're waiting for. Why? Because that sentence contains Jane where you expected it to contain whom. There is no WH phrase in the deep structure that can be WH moved. The structural description of the WH movement transformation is not satisfied. As a result, WH movement fails to apply and the minus WH sits there in the sentence unutilized. Furthermore, and much more damagingly than that technical problem, there is a substantive problem, which is that the deep structure Balu is the man you met Jane in Delhi does not correspond to a possible surface structure. Human languages don't permit such sentences. There is nothing a language can do with the deep structure Balu is the man minus WH, you met Jane in Delhi. The two sentences cannot be connected to form a coherent larger sentence. So if somebody asks you, is the need to filter out this derivation a need that arises from our technical gadgetry alone, independent of the properties of human languages? Or does it arise from the properties of human languages? In this derivation, Balu is the man minus WH, you met Jane in Delhi. The fact that there's a minus WH in the sentence which remains unutilized is a problem with our technical gadgetry. Since the insertion of that device is optional, you will also get a derivation Balu is the man you met Jane in Delhi without the minus WH, where that technical gadgetry problem does not arise. So that is not the reason why that derivation needs to be filtered out. But if you put these derivations side by side, you will see they have something in common. They have a relative clause, in other words, an S, sister of NP and daughter of NP. And in their relative clause, these derivations have not lexically inserted any relative constituent. There is not a single WH word in the sentence. As a result, even though the construction is that of a relative clause, if you look at the phrase structure, the lexical material is not that of a relative clause. You don't have a relative phrase there. Consequently, relative clauses require WH movement to apply, and here that doesn't happen. There is a failure to apply WH movement because the structural description of that rule is not satisfied, and these sentences get filtered out. The filtering out for these substantive reasons is something shared by both the derivations Balu is the man minus WH, you met Jane in Delhi, and the derivation Balu is the man you met Jane in Delhi, where the minus WH was not generated. So the first derivation with the minus WH and the Jane has two problems, a gadgetry problem and a substantive problem. The second derivation, the one without the minus WH but with the Jane, has only the substantive problem. These are academic distinctions. It doesn't matter to us. We have to make sure that these materials which are not suitable for making a relative clause appear at the surface structure level need to be filtered out. That need was detected at the very start of the generative transformational syntactic study of relative clauses in English in the 1960s. The proposal made at that time for the filtering was, in terms of technical gadgetry, different from what we are doing today. What we are doing today is say that if there is unused gadgetry at the level of the surface structure, such as minus WH, then the derivation crashes because at the surface structure level you have basically a filtering device that checks to see whether surface structures contain any unused gadgetry, and if they see such material, they say, wow, there's unused gadgetry, this is a bad surface structure, therefore the whole derivation is bad. That is sufficient for a case where minus WH has been generated in the tree. It is not sufficient if the derivation started with the deep structure Balu is the man you met Jane in Delhi. But as you will learn when you look more closely at the structure of the clause, there is a complementizer node under which the -WH is generated, and that place has to be filled by something, at least a delta. So there is no risk of a derivation not having a gadgetry problem. So any derivation where the relative clause material is inappropriate will have a technical gadgetry problem, and we will be able to filter out such a derivation in keeping with our current proposal. The 1960s proposal was different because of the technical gadgetry of that period being different. In the 1960s, the proposal that was made when this problem was first noticed is that every sentence has on both sides of it a sentence boundary. The sentence boundary was notationally a double word boundary. Recall that a word boundary is a crosshatch, this kind of thing which in present day parlance is often called a hash. A word boundary is a hash. A sentence boundary, as people imagined it in the 1960s, was a double hash. So every sentence has a double hash at the beginning and a double hash at the end. The proposal for filtering was that when there is a transformation integrating a sentence into a higher sentence that embeds it, then that transformation, in addition to doing its own basic work, deletes these sentence boundaries in the embedded sentence, or rather on both sides of the embedded sentence. If the transformation fails to apply, for example, if you have relative clause material that is inappropriate and therefore the relative clause transformation, which is WH movement, fails to apply, then it also fails to delete the sentence boundaries, which gives you the result that at the end of the day, when you're looking at the surface structure, the detector of bad gadgetry will notice that there are these undeleted sentence boundaries sitting inside the matrix sentence, and the detector will say, sorry, there is illegitimate material here, this is a bad surface structure, therefore we are filtering out the derivation, we are condemning the derivation. That is how the filtering proposal was first formulated. Today, we don't need the sentence boundary device because, as you can see, the spirit of that proposal was that there should be unused gadgetry in the surface structure, and that should be sufficient to condemn it. We now have a lot more gadgetry in the picture, so we don't need those sentence boundaries to be part of the game. Now let us introduce the way relative clauses are co-indexed with their antecedents, which is part of the integration of the relative clause into the matrix sentence in the present day theory. We show it as rule number 5, which we call relative constituent co-indexing. In this rule, in order to cover the whole sentence, we have variables at the start and the finish of the structural description written as X and Z. In addition, we show that there is a noun phrase with an S sister and a noun phrase mother. We show this in the label bracketing that is indicated in the rule itself. Notice that one feature of the way we use label bracketing in this particular course, when we write these rules, is that when there is an initial or left bracket shown with a label, our structural descriptions do not show you where the constituent ends typically, because often the right bracket gets swallowed up by a variable. A variable, recall, contains all the necessary material without any distinction. A variable therefore covers nodes as well as closing boundaries. So if you look at formulation 5 and notice the left brackets for NP and S and begin to wonder what happened to the right brackets, the answer is the right brackets of NP and S should be imagined as being part of variable Z. We wanted to make this point clear because otherwise that will be a frequently asked question in this course. Notice that the noun phrase shown in the relative constituent co-indexing structural description between the variables Y and Z as factor number 4 is a noun phrase carrying the feature -WH. That means it is a noun phrase with a WH word in it that carries the relative feature rather than the interrogative feature. This can be confusing for beginners. Beginners might imagine that a minus WH noun phrase is a noun phrase like Tom or Jane, which is not a WH phrase at all? No, that is not the point. The point is, just as plus tense is a finite auxiliary and minus tense is a non-finite auxiliary such as to or ex-ing, likewise plus WH is an interrogative WH element and minus WH is a relative WH element. So just as the tense feature has two values, plus tense and minus tense, but both belong in the system of tenses, the positive part of the system and the negative part of the system called non-finite, just as minus tense, for example, cannot be used for a noun phrase simply because noun phrases are not tenses. Likewise, minus WH refers to one part of the WH spectrum in feature terms. Minus WH is not simply saying this is not a WH phrase, this is another noun phrase like Tom or Dick or Jane or Susan. That is not the point. Minus WH does not mean Tom or Dick or Jane or Susan. Minus WH means a WH word which is relative rather than interrogative. Plus WH means a relative word which, an interrogative word, a WH word which is interrogative rather than relative. We want to make that clear before you get thoroughly confused by the minus in the feature minus WH. Minus is a value for the WH feature. If the WH feature appears on a noun phrase at all with a plus or a minus, that means there is a WH word in the noun phrase, and the question is, which kind of WH word is it? Is it an interrogative word, which is called plus WH, or is it a relative word, which is called minus WH? That is the question. So in this statement, a relative clause co-indexing, we make sure that the relative clause, in particular the relative constituent in the relative clause, the minus WH noun phrase, which is factor number 4 in the statement that we have given as number 5, gets co-indexed with the second factor, which is the antecedent NP, the sister of the relative S. Notice that in the structural description, that antecedent NP is indicated as carrying the subscript I, its referential index, and that in our structural change we show to the right hand side of the transformational double arrow that factor number 4, which is that relative NP, is assigned the same subscript I as factor number 2 already carries. That is the way in which our notation states that a relative constituent gets co-indexed with its antecedent by this transformation number 5. We now, as promised, turn to the contrast between relative clauses which can occur one after the other stacked, attached to the same NP, and complement clauses which do not appear with any stacking because they are introduced once only by a non-recursive phrase structure rule. NP gets rewritten as det NS. The examples we give you are 6 and 7. 6 is the fact that Ahmed smokes doesn't surprise us, where the fact that Ahmed smokes contains a complement clause that Ahmed smokes, which is a complement of the head noun fact. The contrast is between 6, where there is a complement clause, and 7, example 7, the cigarettes that Ahmed smokes are expensive, where that Ahmed smokes is a relative clause. This is a minimal pair. Notice that the complement clause is the string of 3 words that Ahmed smokes. The relative clause is exactly the same string of 3 words that Ahmed smokes, but the two are syntactically quite different. In the fact that Ahmed smokes is a complement clause, and smokes is intransitive. It didn't have an object at all to start with in the deep structure, and obviously doesn't have one in the surface structure. In sentence 7, the cigarettes that Ahmed smokes are expensive. Smokes is a transitive verb. It has an object in the deep structure, a relative noun phrase that is the object, and in the surface structure the object cannot be seen for complicated reasons, including the fact that the relative NP has been deleted. We will have to get back to that deletion later, but that is the reason these two strings look identical. Now let us look at the fact that the relative construction doesn't always have the format that we have illustrated so far, where there is a noun phrase up there, which is the antecedent, and then there is a relative clause containing a relative phrase which gets co-indexed with that antecedent. That isn't always what happens. You have relatives that don't have an antecedent, such as what you see is what you get, such as whoever knows Susan also knows Mary, such as whatever you may have done, Anwar won't care. In all these constructions, there is, as you can see, a relative word, but it has no antecedent. Since the antecedent of a relative clause is the noun phrase heading the noun phrase sentence construction, heading the relative structure as a whole, the antecedent noun phrase is often called a head noun phrase. Consequently, generative syntacticians often call these relative clauses where the antecedent is missing headless relative clauses. Another term frequently used is free relative clauses, because the relative phrase is normally said to be bound by its antecedent. The anaphoric relation is often expressed by saying the antecedent binds the element that is anaphoric to it, just as in the other direction we express the connection by speaking of anaphoric. So a relative that is not free, a relative that is not bound is free. Since there is no binder in these structures, since there is no head NP, since there is no antecedent NP, the result is these relative clauses can be called headless or antecedentless or free. Free means not bound. There is another type of relative clause construction that does not fit the simple picture that NP dominates NP and S. There is an antecedent and a relative attached to it. This other exceptional pattern appears frequently in Indian languages. It is known as the correlative construction. One example from Hindi Urdu is example 12. जिस बच्चे को जो इनाम चाहिए था उसको number 12. जिस बच्चे को जहाँ जो इनाम चाहिए था उसको वहाँ वो मिल गया. In this sentence, which means whichever child wanted whichever prize wherever, he or she got that prize there. It's a correlative structure where the construction begins with a relative clause, in this case a clause containing three relative phrases, whichever child, whichever prize and wherever, and this is followed by a sequent clause which contains three sequent phrases that pick up the reference of the relative phrases. So corresponding to the relatives, whichever child, whichever prize and wherever, you have the sequent phrases that go he or she, that prize, there. This is a correlative structure, and you can immediately see, it was noticed by generative syntacticians in the 1970s, that such a structure cannot possibly conform to the model that NP dominates NP and S, and the S is attached to the NP. Why is that impossible? Because here you have three attachments to handle, and one sentence cannot be simultaneously attached to three noun phrases. There is no way to make that happen. Therefore, some other solution had to be found and was found for this unconventional relative structure. We leave that other solution for debates that you will learn about in advanced syntax. We leave you with the knowledge that correlatives have some special properties. One of these special properties is that you cannot put the sequent clause first. Instead of saying whichever child wanted whichever prize, wherever that child got that prize there. You cannot say that child got that prize there, which child wanted which prize where, which in Hindi would come out as उस बच्चे को वहाँ वो इनाम मिल गया जिसको जहाँ जो चाहिए था. This is bad Hindi. However, if you have a single relative phrase involved, as in sentence 14, the children who wanted prizes arrived quickly in the correlative format, जिन बच्चों को इनाम चाहिए था वे तुरंत पहुँच गए. Then it becomes possible to put the sequent clause first and allow the relative clause to appear second, as in sentence 15, वे बच्चे तुरंत पहुँच गए जिनको इनाम चाहिए था, which means those children arrived quickly who wanted the prize. These are among the properties that the solution to the problem of the correct constituent structure for multiple relative endowed correlative structures will have to take into account. I'm using here the future time, mind you, not the future tense, by using the auxiliary will, because the debate is inconclusive. We do not yet have a consensual answer to the question of how multiple relatives should be handled in a transformational account. There are several solutions that have been put in place. It is not as if we don't have a solution to the problem. The embarrassment is that we have several and that the debate is not really conclusive. We don't yet have a consensus on which of the solutions should be widely adopted. We now return to a topic that quickly came up earlier in this discussion, the deletion of relatives in certain environments. Remember that we compared the complement clause that Ahmed smokes with the relative clause that Ahmed smokes, and we noted that the relative clause that Ahmed smokes involves deletion of the relative constituent. Let us now take a closer look at relative constituent deletion in general. Sentence 16 in English, the man whom you met in Delhi is my brother, also has the alternate form, 17, the man you met in Delhi is my brother. This is a familiar fact. You must have learned it in school grammar. It's part of learning English that you can do this. What your school grammar didn't teach you, however, is that there are some constructions where the deletion of the relative clause has to happen. In the case of 16 and 17, the man whom you met in Delhi and the man you met in Delhi, you can do it, it's optional. But we're about to give you examples where the relative phrase must be deleted. Consider 18. You have to say, you had more fun at Sarah's party than you had at Jill's party. Well, you don't have to say it. Suppose you had more fun at Jill's party, but that's not what I meant. What I meant is, grammatically, you cannot say you had more fun at Sarah's party than what you had at Jill's party. The what must be deleted. Likewise, you have to say more children visited Sarah than visited Jill. You cannot say more children visited Sarah than who visited Jill. Likewise, you had as much fun at Sarah's party as what you had at Jill's party is bad. The what must be deleted. As many children visited Sarah as who visited Jill is bad. You have to say as visited Jill. We have given you an exercise where Bangla exhibits a similar construction, and you're invited to work it out for yourself. Now we turn from finite relative clauses, where the verbal complex in the relative clause has a finite tense, present or past, to non-finite contexts like infinitival clauses. In infinitival clauses, certain languages allow relative constituents to appear. You will be surprised to hear this, because this is not discussed in school grammar. Thus you get 26a. This is a great house in which to live. Many speakers of English don't say a great house in which to live. They say instead, this is a great house to live in, where the relative phrase disappears, the word which disappears. Likewise, instead of saying, that was a good knife with which to cut fruit, people very often say, that was a good knife to cut fruit with. There are two things to notice here. One is that the alternation here between in which and in shows that either English leaves the preposition behind when the relative moves up to the left edge of its clause and gets deleted. So you get the output, a nice house to live in. When that happens, we speak of preposition stranding. The preposition in is left behind or stranded when the relative moves up. And in this case also gets deleted, but deletion is not essential for preposition stranding. Or the other alternative that shows up in the variant that contains the overt visible relative phrase, what you get is, this is a nice house in which to live. When that variant is used, the WH as it moves up carries the preposition along with it. This carrying along has been compared with a fairy tale, with the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, where this Pied Piper, this man who used to play a pipe or a flute to take revenge on a mayor after solving the rat problem of the city, he uses his magic to lure all the children of the city away and to take them along with him. So such children can be called pied-piped children, and using that metaphor, this preposition that is carried along with the moving WH is called a pied-piped preposition. Therefore, there are two strategies that languages follow when a WH movement affects a noun phrase that has a preposition with it. Either the preposition gets left behind, that is called preposition stranding, or it gets carried along with the WH when the WH moves to the left. This is similar to our use of the story, The Princess and the Pea. The difference is the Princess and the Pea is our decision to use a story, whereas the pied-piping metaphor has been standard in linguistics from the 1960s onwards. Everybody uses it. Now let us get back to the deletion of the WH element in a nice house in which to live, or a good knife to cut fruit with. In these structures, you would expect it to be possible to either retain the relative pronoun which or delete it. If that expectation had been met, English would allow you to say a good knife to cut fruit with, or a good knife which to cut fruit with. English would have allowed you to say a nice house to live in, or a nice house which to live in. As you all know, English does not allow the variants a nice house which to live in and a great knife which to cut fruit with. You have to delete the relative pronoun in these constructions which carry the infinitive in the downstairs clause. This deletion, however, is only up to recoverability. What does that mean? That means you don't delete non-recoverable elements. How do you know this? You know this because in these structures, if there is a preposition, the preposition does not get deleted. Notice that English doesn't allow a nice house to live in to surface as a nice house to live. English doesn't allow a great knife to cut fruit with to turn into a great knife to cut fruit. The with and the in have to surface. This suggests that the deletion process only deletes recoverable material here as elsewhere. That makes you ask, What is it about relative pronouns that makes it possible for the recoverability convention to treat them as rubbish that you can delete without any damage? The reason we are asking this question is that interrogative WH cannot be deleted. So how come relative WH is deletable? Why is it regarded as recoverable? Because these WHs, unlike the interrogatives, send you back to an antecedent, and the antecedent allows you to recover the content of the relative. There are, if you remember, exceptions to my statement that relatives have an antecedent. Recall that the Indian language correlatives are an exception. Recall that the headless relatives found all over the world, including English, are an exception. That's right. In Indian language correlatives, relatives don't have an antecedent. Therefore, they cannot be deleted. They're not recoverable. In free relatives or headless relatives, relatives don't have an antecedent. Therefore, there is no way to retrieve their content if they're deleted. Therefore, they're not deleted. Precisely. So those exceptions prove the rule. Relatives are recoverable when they have an antecedent. In the final section of this module, we deal with complement selection phenomena. Since we have introduced complement clauses to round off the discussion of complement clauses, we point out to you a range of phenomena, such as that certain complement clauses are declarative, others are interrogative, and that the verb in the matrix sentence lexically selects either an interrogative or a declarative kind of complement. These complement selection phenomena are among the things that you need to understand for a complete account of complement clauses. That, however, does not mean that the oral exposition has to follow to the letter every part of the e-text. We have clearly exhausted your attention span and are going to stop here with a summary. In this module on relatives and complements, we exhaustively discussed the properties of the recursive rule that introduces classical headed relatives and the complement clause rule that introduces complement clauses. We noted that the classical relative clause rule is recursive and thus permits stacking. We also noted that there are relative clauses that are non-classical, such as headless relatives and such as the correlative structure found in Indian languages. We did not here offer a formal analysis of those non-canonical structures. We merely noted their existence. We then went into the details of non-finite structures where relatives appear, infinitival relatives in English, and used the material to introduce some terminology about prepositions in the context of WH movement that every learner of transformational syntax must master, namely the terms preposition, stranding, and pied, piping. And we covered several other topics that are essential to the understanding of relative clauses and complement clauses. We placed the whole thing initially in the context of the filtering problem. It turns out that relatives occasioned the first discussion of filtering and are therefore a good context in which we can introduce this material. In order to get a clearer understanding of all the details in this module, more than in several other modules, you will have to study the e-text very closely. And we encourage you also to study the supplementary readings and to get back to us with any feedback that you might have. Thank you for your attention.